The wind coming off Pine Ridge carried the sharp, undeniable bite of late November. It rattled the loose tin on the woodshed and swept dead oak leaves across the wide wooden planks of Arthur Pendleton's front porch. Arthur stood just inside the screen door, a steaming mug of black coffee cradled in his calloused hands. He was a tall, gently stooped man of 68, his silver hair thinning at the crown and a neatly trimmed grey beard framing a face weathered by decades of carpentry and mountain sun. He wore faded denim overalls over a thick thermal Henley shirt, his worn leather work boots firmly planted on the threshold. He liked this time of evening, the purple dusk that settled over Oak Haven, Oregon, muting the world into quiet greys and deep blues. But tonight the quiet felt different. As he took a slow sip of his coffee, a soft creak broke the stillness. It wasn't the wind, it was the old cedar porch swing, the one he had built with his own 2 hands 30 years ago. Swaying just an inch or two back and forth, the chains groaned faintly. Arthur narrowed his eyes against the fading light. There, huddled in the deep shadows beneath the swing, was a shape. It was perfectly still, blending into the dark wood, save for the slight rhythmic rise and fall of breathing. Arthur did not turn on the porch light. He knew better than to startle whatever had sought refuge against his house. Slowly, deliberately, he pushed the screen door open, letting it rest softly against his shoulder so it wouldn't squeak. The cold air rushed in, smelling of pine needles and coming snow. He stepped out, his boots making a soft thud on the plank. The shape shifted. 2 amber gold eyes flashed in the darkness, catching the faint reflection of the wood stove light from the window. The ears, tall and jet black backed with prominent tufts, swiveled toward him. It was a North American bobcat. She was smaller than he would have expected, her tawny tan grey rosette spotted coat puffed against the cold. But what caught Arthur's breath was the way she held herself. Her front left shoulder was hunched, pulled tightly against her chest, and she didn't bolt. A wild bobcat should have vanished the moment the door opened. Instead, she just watched him, her short bobbed black-tipped tail pressed flat beneath her. There was a small pale notch missing from her left ear, giving her a rugged, battle-worn look. Arthur froze. He had lived in Oak Haven long enough to know the wild things of the forest. He knew their boundaries, their rules. This proximity was unnatural. It spoke of desperation. "Well now," Arthur murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that barely carried over the wind. Uve wandered a long way from the ridge. "Little one." The bobcat's eyes remained fixed on his. She didn't hiss, didn't bare her teeth. She simply blinked. A slow, heavy drop of her eyelids that spoke of profound exhaustion. She was shivering, a fine tremor running through her spotted coat. Arthur stood there for a long time, the coffee cooling in his mug. He understood the instinct to hide when the world got too cold. He had been doing it himself for the past 4 years. If you are listening to this and this story of quiet survival touches your heart, please feel free to leave a gentle like or subscribe to the channel. We would love to know where you are watching from, and if there is an animal that has left a mark on your own life, tell us their name in the comments. We read everyone. He took one slow step backward, retreating into the warmth of the cabin. He didn't close the inner door, only the screen, making sure the latch didn't click. Through the wire mesh, he watched her. She hadn't moved. The cedar swing swayed above her, a protective canopy in the gathering storm. Arthur walked into the kitchen, his boots heavy on the linoleum. He opened the refrigerator and pulled out a package of raw chicken he had intended to stew for his own dinner. He cut a generous portion, placed it on a small ceramic saucer, and walked back to the door. He didn't step outside this time. He just cracked the screen door open and slid the saucer onto the floorboards, pushing it gently with the toe of his boot until it was just outside the threshold. Then he retreated into the shadows of his living room, sitting heavily in his armchair. Outside, the wind howled louder. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. Arthur didn't move. He watched the saucer. Finally, a shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness beneath the swing. The bobcat moved vekep ite at painful slowness. She dragged her left leg slightly, putting no weight on the shoulder. She crept toward the porch light's edge, her white barred belly brushing the cold wood. When she reached the saucer, she didn't eat immediately. She looked up, straight through the screen door, into the darkness where Arthur sat. It was a look of pure, wild calculation. Then she lowered her head and ate. Arthur let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. He watched her finish the meal, lick her chops, and turn back toward the swing. She didn't leave the porch. She crawled back under the cedar planks, curling tightly into a ball. Arthur Pendleton leaned back in his chair, listening to the wind rattle the windows. For the first time in a very long time, the empty house didn't feel quite so hollow. He kept the porch light off, letting the wild thing rest in the dark, and waited for the snow to fall. The morning broke grey and heavy, the sky choked with snow clouds that hadn't yet let go of their burden. Arthur woke before the sun, a habit ingrained from 40 years of framing houses and pouring foundations before the dew had dried. He sat on the edge of his bed, the familiar ache in his lower back greeting him as it always did. He pulled on his thick wool socks, his movements slow and methodical in the quiet room. The silence of the cabin was a physical weight, something he pushed against every morning. It had been 4 years since Martha passed, 4 years since the illness took her, leaving the house on the edge of Whispering Creek far too large for one man. She had been the noise in his life, the humming in the kitchen, the radio playing softly on the windowsill, the constant gentle rearrangement of his tools which drove him crazy and which he now missed with a physical pang. Without her, Arthur had retreated. He stopped going into town unless he needed supplies from Miller S. Hardware. He stopped taking custom furniture orders. He spent his days carving small wooden figures from cedar blocks, letting the shavings pile up around his boots, and his evenings sitting in the armchair, listening to the forest. He walked into the kitchen, the floorboards groaning under his weight. He filled the percolator and set it on the stove, striking a match to light the burner. As the coffee began to brew, filling the room with its dark, bitter scent, he walked to the front window. He didn't know what he expected to see. A part of him, the practical carpenter who knew the brutal reality of nature, expected the porch to be empty. Wild things moved on, they survived by staying hidden. But another part of him, a part that felt foolish for hoping, wanted the shadow to still be there. He peered through the frosty pane. The cedar porch swing hung perfectly still. The space beneath it was empty. Arthur felt a sudden, sharp dip in his chest. He sighed, a short puff of white breath against the cold glass. "Course," he muttered to himself. "What did you expect? Old man?" He turned back to the stove, poured his coffee into a chipped blue mug that had once been Martha S.'s favourite, and walked to the front door. He needed to fetch firewood. He pulled on his heavy canvas coat and pushed the screen door open. The cold hit him instantly. He stepped onto the porch and stopped. There, huddled not under the swing, but in the far corner of the porch behind a stack of curing oak logs, was the Bobcat. She was awake. Her amber gold eyes watched him with unblinking intensity. She was pressed tightly into the corner, seeking the windbreak the logs provided. In the harsh, flat light of morning, Arthur could see her condition more clearly. She was painfully thin, her tawny coat dull and matted in places. The notch in her left ear was an old battle scar, healed clean, but her left shoulder was a different story. It was swollen, the fur parted awkwardly to reveal a dark, jagged scrape that looked inflamed. It wasn't a fresh, bleeding wound, but it was deep, and the way she held her leg tucked tight against her rib cage told him she was in immense pain. Arthur didn't move toward her. He knew that cornering a wounded predator, no matter how small or exhausted, was a fool's errand. He took a slow sip of his coffee, letting the steam warm his face. "You real stubborn one," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. The Bobcat-S black-tipped tail twitched, a tiny, nervous flick against the wood. She didn't growl, but she shifted her weight backward, pressing deeper into the shadows of the logs. Arthur turned his back to her, deliberately breaking eye contact. He walked slowly down the porch steps and out to the woodpile in the yard. He took his time selecting 3 good-sized split logs, feeling the rough bark against his glove. He walked back up the steps, his boots thumping a steady, predictable rhythm. He didn't look at her as he passed the logs. He opened the door, went inside, and deposited the wood by the stove. When he came back out, he brought a shallow tin bowl filled with warm water. He walked to the edge of the porch, halfway between the door and her corner, and set it down. He didn't push it toward her. He just left it there, turned, and went back inside, closing the heavy wooden door behind him. For the rest of the morning, Arthur stayed in his workshop at the back of the house. He took a piece of seasoned cherry wood and began to work it with a draw knife. He focused on the grain, on the smooth curls of wood falling to the floor, but his mind kept wandering to the front porch. Around noon, the snow began to fall. It started as fine, dry flakes that swirled in the wind, dusting the pine trees and the roof of the shed. Arthur wiped his tools, hung his apron on its peg, and walked through the house to the front window. The water bowl was empty. The saucer from the night before was licked clean. The bobcat was back under the cedar swing, curled into a tight knot against the rising cold. Arthur watched the snow accumulate on the porch railing. He looked at the swing. Martha had loved that swing. She used to sit there on summer evenings, a quilt over her lap, reading paperbacks until the light faded. He hadn't sat in it since she died. It felt wrong to use it alone. Now a wild, broken creature had claimed the space beneath it as a sanctuary. Arthur rested his forehead against the cold glass. He knew he should interfere. Nature was cruel, and intervening often prolonged the inevitable. But as he watched the snow begin to drift across the floorboards, threatening to reach the shivering animal under the swing, Arthur made a decision. He wasn't going to let another thing die at his house. The snow fell steadily through the afternoon, burying Oakhaven under a thick white blanket. The wind died down, leaving the forest wrapped in a profound, heavy silence. Inside the cabin, Arthur kept the wood stove burning hot, the dry oak cracking and hissing behind the iron door. He moved through his kitchen with quiet purpose, preparing a richer meal. He boiled a piece of venison he had in the freezer, making sure it was completely unseasoned, and shredded it into small, easily manageable pieces. He added a little of the warm broth to the bowl to keep it from freezing too quickly outside. By 4 o'clock, the light was already failing. Arthur put on his coat, picked up the bowl, and walked to the front door. He opened it slowly. The porch was a study in black and white, the dark wood contrasting sharply with the pristine snow that had blown over the edges. The bobcat was still there, a miserable, shivering mound beneath the cedar swing. The snow had drifted close to her, dusting her tawny fur with white crystals. She looked up as the door opened, her amber eyes duller than they had been that morning. She did even try to pull back into the shadows. She was simply too weak. Arthur's heart gave a painful tug. He stepped out, ignoring the bite of the cold. He didn't stop halfway this time. He walked slowly, deliberately, straight toward the swing. The bobcat watched him approach. Her ears flattened slightly, a residual instinct of fear, but she didn't hiss. As Arthur knelt about 4 feet away, he could hear her breathing, a shallow, ragged sound that rattled in her chest. He set the bowl of warm venison on the floorboards and gently pushed it toward her until it was just a few inches from her nose. The steam rose in the freezing air, carrying the rich scent of the meat. The bobcat's nose twitched. She stretched her neck forward, her movements agonizingly slow. She didn't stand. She stayed curled on her side, dragging her head toward the bowl. She began to eat, chewing weakly, her eyes never leaving Arthur's face. He didn't move. He stayed kneeling on the hard wood, the cold seeping through his denim overalls, and watched her. As she ate, he studied her injured shoulder. The wound looked worse up close. The surrounding tissue was tight and angry, the skin pulled taut over the joint. It wasn't just a scratch. It looked like she had taken a heavy blow or perhaps been caught in something and torn herself free. When she finished the meat, she let her head rest on the edge of the bowl, too exhausted to pull back. "You in a bad way, aren't you?" Arthur whispered. He slowly reached out his hand. He didn't aim for her head or her body. He simply rested his calloused palm on the floorboards between them. Palm up, completely still, the bobcat stared at his hand. She knew what hands were. They were danger. They were traps. They were the things that threw stones and held loud, booming sticks. But this hand wasn't moving. It just lay there, a warm, quiet presence in the freezing air. For a long minute, neither of them moved. Then, the bobcat did something Arthur would never forget. She slowly shifted her weight, dragging her good front paw forward, and rested it lightly on the very edge of his thick leather glove. It wasn't an embrace. It wasn't a pet seeking affection. It was a tentative, desperate test. She was assessing him, weighing her fear against her absolute exhaustion. Arthur didn't flinch. He didn't try to curl his fingers around her paw. He let her feel the steady, unmoving solidity of his hand. After a few seconds, she withdrew her paw, curled it back under her chest, and closed her eyes. Arthur slowly stood up, his knees popping in the cold. He picked up the empty bowl and backed away. He knew she wouldn't survive the night if the temperature dropped much further, even sheltered under the swing. He needed to do something more. He went inside and walked to the hall closet. He pulled out an old, heavy wool blanket, a dark green one with a frayed edge that he used to keep in the back of his truck. He took it out to the porch. He didn't try to cover her. Instead, he carefully draped the blanket over the back and seat of the cedar swing, letting the thick wool hang down over the front edge, creating a makeshift tent. He left one side open so she would feel trapped. It wasn't too much, but it blocked the wind and held in a fraction of her body heat. The bobcat watched him work, her amber eyes tracking his movements. When he finished, he stepped back. "Stay warm," he told her softly. He went inside and locked the door. He didn't carve that evening. He sat in his armchair by the stove, a book open on his lap, but he didn't read a single page. He listened to the wind howling through the pines, worrying about the fragile life flickering just on the other side of his wall. He thought about Martha, about how she would have scolded him for being out in the cold, and how she would have immediately started warming blankets by the fire for the poor creature. Arthur closed his eyes, the memory bringing a familiar dull ache. He was a man who fixed things. He built houses, repaired roofs, mended fences, but he hadn't been able to fix Martha now. The forest had delivered a broken thing right to his doorstep. He didn't know if he could fix the bobcat, but as he listened to the storm rage outside, he knew he was going to try. The morning after the heavy snow, Arthur woke to a world cast in brilliant, blinding white. The storm had blown itself out, leaving behind a profound stillness that seemed to echo in the empty cabin. He went through his morning routine, the thick socks, the coffee, the quiet shuffle to the front window. When he looked out, the green wool blanket was completely buried under a drift. But a small, dark tunnel had been dug through the snow leading out from under the swing. The water bowl was frozen solid, but the small tin plate he had left out with more shredded venison the night before was empty. Arthur felt a small, hard knot of tension ease in his chest. She survived the night. He didn't rush outside. He knew that any sudden movement, any disruption of the fragile peace she had found, could send her fleeing into the deadly cold. He spent the morning clearing the back path to the woodshed, the rhythmic chunk of the snow shovel breaking the silence of the forest. When he finally walked around to the front porch, he did so slowly, humming a low, tuneless melody to announce his presence. He reached the porch steps and stopped. The bobcat was sitting just inside the tunnel she had dug, the wool blanket hanging like a curtain behind her. She looked worse in the bright sunlight. The cold had drawn her tight, highlighting every rib, and her left leg was still tucked painfully against her body, but her amber eyes were clear, tracking his every movement with sharp intelligence. Arthur didn't try to get close. He set a fresh bowl of warm water on the top step, placed another portion of meat beside it, and backed away. He walked down the driveway, creating a wide berth, and went back into the house through the kitchen door. This became their routine for the next 5 days. It was a slow, silent dance of boundaries and provisions. Arthur learned to announce his arrival with a specific sequence of sounds. The heavy thud of his boots on the floorboards, the squeak of the inner door handle, the low hum in his throat. He never varied the pattern. He wanted her to know exactly what was coming, to remove the element of surprise that terrified Wild Things. He noticed small changes. On the third day, she didn't retreat into the shadows when he opened the door. She simply watched him from the edge of the blanket. On the fourth day, he noticed her grooming her good shoulder, her rough pink tongue working the matted fur, a sign that the immediate crisis of survival had passed and she was beginning to care for herself again. But her injured leg remained a problem. She still refused to put weight on it, hobbling awkwardly on 3 legs when she needed to move. Arthur watched her struggle from the window, his carpenter-esque mind analysing the mechanics of her movement. The joint was stiff, the muscles around it visibly atrophied from disuse. He knew he couldn't force her to let him examine it. He had to wait. The turning point came on a Tuesday, an overcast afternoon that felt heavy with impending rain. Arthur was sitting in his armchair, reading, when he heard a strange sound from the porch. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't the creak of the swing. It was a sharp, repetitive scratching. He set his book down and walked quietly to the window. The Bobcat was out from under the blanket. She was standing near the centre of the porch, her attention focused on a thick braided rug Martha had woven years ago to wipe muddy boots on. The rug was frozen stiff, caked in ice and snow. The Bobcat was pawing at it, her claws digging into the frozen fibres, trying to scratch at a smell she found interesting. But she wasn't using just a good paw. She was trying to use her injured left leg to hold the rug down while she scratched with the right. Arthur watched, his breath caught in his throat. She placed the left paw on the rug and pushed. The leg buckled instantly. She let out a sharp, breathless hiss, not a sound of anger, but a pure, involuntary vocalization of pain, and stumbled sideways, landing heavily on her flank. She lay there for a moment, her sides heaving, her eyes squeezed shut. Arthur's hand went to the doorknob, his instinct screaming at him to go out and help her. But he stopped himself. He knew that rushing out would only panic her, turning the pain into fear. He waited. After a long minute, she opened her eyes. She slowly righted herself, gathering her legs under her veille-capite at painful caution. She didn't look at the rug again. She hobbled back to her sanctuary under the swing, dragging the injured leg slightly more than before. Arthur stepped back from the window, running a hand through his thinning silver hair. He walked into the kitchen, his heart heavy. She was trying to heal, but the injury was deeper than a simple scrape. It was structural. Something was broken or torn. He pulled the phone book from the drawer under the counter and opened it to the yellow pages. He ran his calloused finger down the list of numbers, stopping at veterinarians. There was a clinic in town, but they handled mostly dogs and cats, the occasional horse or cat. He didn't know if they would know or Verkep what to do with a wild bobcat, or if they would even agree to come out. But as he listened to the silence of the cabin, the memory of her sharp hiss echoing in his mind, he knew he could just leave her to figure it out alone. He picked up the receiver and began to dial. The phone call was shorter than Arthur expected. The veterinarian, a brusque but practical woman named Sarah Jenkins, listened to his description of the Bobcat-S injury with professional detachment. She told him what he already suspected. Without seeing the animal, she couldn't diagnose the problem, but attempting to trap a wounded, terrified predator was a recipe for disaster. She advised him to continue providing food and water, monitor the healing process, and call her if the animal's condition drastically deteriorated. "They read tougher than we think. Mr. Pendleton," her voice crackled over the old landline. "Sometimes the best thing you can do is just give them a safe place to heal." Arthur hung up the phone, feeling a strange mixture of relief and frustration. He was a man of action, used to fixing broken things with his hands. Waiting felt like a failure of duty. But he understood the logic. Over the next 2 weeks, a delicate, Unspoken treaty formed on the front porch of the cabin. Arthur continued his strict routine, never deviating from his schedule. The bobcat, in turn, began to show tiny, almost imperceptible signs of trust. It started with the food bowl. Initially, she would wait until Arthur was safely back inside the house before emerging to eat. Then, one evening, as he knelt to place the warm venison on the floorboards, she didn't retreat under the swing. She stayed at the edge of the blanket, her amber eyes watching him intently. Arthur deliberately slowed his movements. He placed the bowl down, stood up smoothly, and took 2 steps backward. He didn't go inside. He stood there in the cold air, his hands deep in his coat pockets, and waited. For a long time, the only sound was the wind in the pines. The bobcat stared at him, her body tense, ready to spring back into the shadows at the slightest provocation. Arthur kept his gaze slightly averted, knowing that direct eye contact in the animal kingdom was a challenge. Finally, hunger won out over fear. She took a tentative step forward, her injured leg hovering above the wood. She paused, assessing him again. Arthur remained perfectly still, a silent statue in the fading light. She took another step, then another, until she was at the bowl. She ate quickly, nervously, her ears swiveling constantly to catch any sound of danger. But she didn't run, and Arthur didn't move. When she finished, she looked up at him, a piece of meat still caught on her whiskers. She didn't hiss. She simply turned and hobbled back to her sanctuary. It was a tiny breakthrough, a microscopic shift in the balance of their relationship. But to Arthur, it felt monumental. It was the first time she had accepted his presence while she was vulnerable. The next day, Arthur pushed the boundary slightly further. He brought out his wooden chair from the kitchen, the one with the cracked spindle, and set it near the door. After he placed the food bowl down, he didn't retreat. He sat down in the chair, crossed his arms over his chest, and waited. The bobcat emerged faster this time. She still watched him cautiously, but the paralyzing fear was gone. She ate her meal with Arthur sitting just 6 feet away, the rhythmic sound of her chewing filling the quiet air. As the days turned into weeks, the chair became a permanent fixture on the porch. Arthur began bringing his carving out with him in the afternoons. He would sit in the pale winter sun, working the cedar with his draw knife, the sharp, sweet smell of the wood mingling with the crisp air. The bobcat watched him work. She seemed fascinated by the rhythmic motion of his hands, the curling shavings falling to the floorboards. She would sit at the edge of the blanket, her head tilted slightly, her golden eyes following the knife's path. Arthur talked to her while he worked. He didn't use baby talk or high-pitched tones. He spoke in his normal, gravelly voice, telling her about the grain of the wood, the changing weather, the history of Oakhaven. He told her about Martha, how she used to sit on the porch and knit while he carved, the soft click of her needles keeping time with his knife. She would have liked you, Arthur said one afternoon, pausing to inspect a wooden bear he was shaping. She always had a soft spot for strays. Said they appreciated the quiet more than folks who never had to struggle for it. The bobcat blinked slowly, her ears twitching at the sound of his voice. She didn't understand the words, but Arthur knew she understood the tone. It was a tone of safety, of steady, unwavering calm. And then, one afternoon, the most remarkable thing happened. Arthur was sitting in his chair, a half-finished wooden owl in his lap, the sun warming his face. The bobcat emerged from under the swing. She didn't go to the food bowl. She walked slowly, deliberately, toward Arthur. She stopped about 3 feet away from his boots. She looked up at him, her pale, notched ear flicking once, Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she lowered herself to the floorboards, stretching out her long, spotted body in the patch of sunlight that spilled across the porch. She rested her head on her good paw, closed her eyes, and went to sleep. Arthur sat perfectly still, his carving knife frozen in his hand. He didn't dare breathe too loudly. He watched her chest rise and fall in a slow, even rhythm. The wild thing had chosen to sleep at his feet. In that quiet moment, with the winter sun warming them both, Arthur realized that the empty space in his house didn't feel quite so vast anymore. Winter settled over Pine Ridge with a relentless, icy grip. The days grew short, the sun barely rising above the tree line before plunging the valley back into deep, freezing shadows. For Arthur Pendleton, the season usually meant long, lonely months of isolation, reading old paperbacks by the woodstove and listening to the silence ringing in his ears. But this winter was different. This winter, his days had a purpose, a rhythm dictated not by the clock, but by the quiet needs of the wild creature living on his porch. They had established a routine that felt as natural as the turning of the earth. Arthur woke early, the cold floorboards biting through his socks, and immediately went to the front window. The Bobcat would usually be awake, sitting near the edge of her makeshift tent, her breath forming small clouds in the freezing air, waiting for him. It was Tar, a pet name, but a title earned through observation. She was always watching, always assessing the perimeter of her small world with sharp, intelligent eyes. Their mornings began with breakfast. Arthur would step onto the porch, the heavy screen door groaning on its hinges, and place a bowl of warm water and food near his wooden chair. Scout would approach without hesitation now, though she still moved with that inherent wild caution, never fully dropping her guard. While she ate, Arthur would sit in his chair, sipping his black coffee, watching the forest wake up. Her healing was slow, a grueling process of micro-improvements. The swelling in her left shoulder had gone down considerably, but the joint was permanently altered. When she walked, she threw her weight awkwardly to the right, a pronounced limp that Arthur knew she would carry for the rest of her life. The wild is unforgiving of weakness, and he often wondered how she had survived before finding his porch, how a predator that relied on stealth and explosive speed could hunt with a broken wheel. But Scout was adapting. She learned to navigate the porch with surprising grace despite her injury. She discovered that the stack of firewood provided an excellent vantage point, and she would often spend the late mornings perched there, a tawny statue against the dark oak logs, watching the chickadees flit between the pine branches. Arthur's presence was no longer a source of fear. It was an accepted part of her environment. She treated him the way she might treat a particularly large, immovable boulder, something to be navigated around, but fundamentally harmless. Their afternoons were spent in companionable silence. Arthur would bring his carving tools out to the porch, sitting in the pale winter sun for as long as the temperature allowed. Scout would usually join him, abandoning her perch on the firewood to stretch out on the sun-warmed floorboards near his boots. It was during these quiet hours that Arthur began to notice her quirks, the small behavioral details that defined her personality. She was incredibly fastidious. After every meal, she would spend 20 minutes grooming herself, paying special attention to her injured shoulder, her rough tongue smoothing the fur around the old scar until it lay perfectly flat. She also possessed a strange, almost comical disdain for Arthur's old work gloves. If he left them resting on the porch railing, she would approach them cautiously, sniff them with exaggerated suspicion, and then bat them onto the floor with a swift, disdainful flick of her good paw. Arthur pretended to be annoyed, muttering about disrespectful houseguests, but the small, predictable act always brought a rare, genuine smile to his weathered face. One particularly cold afternoon, the wind howling down from the ridge with vicious intensity, Arthur decided to stay inside. He built up the fire in the woodstove, the heat radiating through the small cabin, and settled into his armchair with a book. An hour later, he heard a sound that made him pause. It was a soft, rhythmic thumping coming from the front porch. He walked to the window and looked out. The wind was whipping the snow across the planks in angry white sheets. Scout was not under her blanket. She was standing near the door, her body pressed against the siding of the house, trying to escape the worst of the... The thumping sound was her tail flicking nervously against the wood. She looked up, seeing Arthur through the glass. Her amber eyes met his, and for the first time, he saw something resembling appeal in her gaze. She was freezing, the wind cutting through her winter coat, and the shelter under the swing was no longer enough. Arthur didn't hesitate. He unlocked the door and pulled it open, stepping back to leave the entrance clear. The wind howled into the cabin, bringing a swirl of snow across the linoleum floor. "Come on," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the storm. Scout stood frozen for a long moment. She looked at the open door, feeling the rush of warm air spilling out, then looked back at Arthur. The threshold was a massive psychological barrier. Inside was the human world. Trapping, dangerous. Arthur didn't move. He kept his hands at his sides, his posture relaxed, offering no pressure, no expectation. Slowly, agonizingly, Scout took a step forward. Her injured paw touched the threshold. She paused, her ears swiveling frantically, her nose twitching as it processed the overwhelming smells of wood smoke, old coffee and human habitation. She took another step, then another, until she was completely inside the cabin. Arthur gently closed the door behind her, shutting out the storm. The sudden silence in the room was deafening. Scout stood rigidly near the door, her tail tucked tight, her eyes wide as she scanned the enclosed space. She looked at the armchair, the bookshelf, the wood stove radiating heat. Then she looked at the braided rug lying near the stove, the same rug she had tried to scratch weeks ago on the porch. She hobbled over to it, her claws clicking softly on the linoleum. She sniffed it thoroughly, turning in a tight circle, before finally collapsing onto the warm fabric with a heavy sigh. Within minutes, she was asleep, her breathing deep and even. Arthur stood by the door, his heart hammering in his chest. He realized he was holding his breath, afraid to break the fragile spell. He walked quietly to his armchair, sitting down with profound care. He looked at the wild bobcat sleeping peacefully by his fire, the flames reflecting in her tawny fur. It was an impossible scene, a moment of profound quiet trust that he knew he had done absolutely nothing to earn, but everything to protect. That first night inside the cabin changed the invisible architecture of their relationship. When the morning broke, clear and bitterly cold, Arthur opened the front door. Scout didn't bolt. She stretched lazily by the stove, her front claws extending and retracting rhythmically in the braided rug, before ambling to the door and stepping out onto the porch. She paused to sniff the frozen air, her notched ear swiveling, then turned back to look at Arthur. She didn't want to leave, but the wild was calling. She walked down the steps, her limp slightly less pronounced after a night of deep warmth, and disappeared into the snow-covered pines. Arthur watched her go, a familiar pang of loss settling in his chest. He fully expected never to see her again. She was healed enough to survive, and wild things rarely stayed when they had a choice. But that evening, as the purple dusk began to gather over Oakhaven, he heard a familiar sound, the soft creak of the cedar porch swing. He walked to the window. Scout was back, but she was huddled underneath the swing on the cold floorboards. She was sitting squarely in the middle of the cedar slats, the green wool blanket bunched comfortably beneath her. She looked perfectly at home, a tawny queen surveying her frozen domain. Arthur smiled, a deep, genuine smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. He went to the kitchen, prepared her bowl of venison and warm water, and carried it out. "Evening, Scout," he rumbled gently. She didn't flinch. She watched him place the bowl down, her tail flicking once in acknowledgement. She jumped down from the swing, ate her meal with her usual fastidious care, and then, instead of retreating to the shadows, she jumped right back up onto the swing. She curled into a tight knot, tucking her nose under her good paw, and closed her eyes. This became their new normal. Scout spent her days in the forest, hunting or exploring the territory around Pine Ridge. Arthur never knew where she went or what she did, and he never tried to follow. He respected her wildness. But as sure as the sun set behind the mountains, she would return every evening. The creak of the swing became the soundtrack to Arthur's dusk. He found himself looking forward to it with an intensity that surprised him. The loneliness that had choked the cabin since Martha died began to lift, replaced by a quiet, steady anticipation. He started carving again with renewed vigor, spending his evenings by the stove, the wood shavings piling up around his boots, knowing that just on the other side of the wall, a wild creature had chosen to sleep near him. Sometimes, when the nights were particularly brutal, the wind howling down the chimney, Arthur would open the door and stand aside. Scout would inevitably trot in, shaking the snow from her coat, and take her spot by the stove on the braided rug. She never explored the rest of the house. The rug and the perimeter immediately around the stove were her designated indoor territory. Arthur would sit in his armchair, reading or carving, and they would exist in a companionable silence. He never tried to pet her. The temptation was there, a deep human urge to touch the soft fur, to feel the purr beneath his hand, but he restrained himself. He knew that crossing that boundary might shatter the fragile trust they had built. Her presence. One evening, Arthur was working on a particularly intricate piece, a small, detailed carving of a bobcat sitting on a log. He had been working on it for weeks, trying to capture the exact set of her tufted ears, the precise angle of her notched left ear. Scout was sleeping on the rug, her breathing deep and even. Arthur paused, his knife hovering over the wood, and looked at her. He studied the curve of her spine, the powerful muscles of her hind leg, the subtle shading of her spots. Suddenly she opened her eyes. She did lift her head, but her golden gaze met his across the room. She stared at him for a long, silent moment. Then, very slowly, she extended her good front paw toward him, stretching it as far as she could, her claws unsheathing slightly before retracting. It was the same gesture she had made weeks ago on the cold porch, but this time it held no desperation, no fear. It was a simple, quiet acknowledgement. Arthur lowered his knife. He slowly extended his own hand, holding it palm up in the space between them. They stayed like that for a full minute, separated by 3 feet of air, tethered by an understanding deeper than words. Then, Scout pulled her paillet back, tucked it under her chin, and closed her eyes again. Arthur went back to his carving, his hand steady, his heart lighter than it had been in years. The house on Whispering Creek was no longer just a place of memories and echoes. It was a shared space, a sanctuary for 2 solitary souls who had found a quiet joy in simply being near each other. The winter raged outside, but inside the fire burned bright and warm. Late February brought a deceptive thaw to Oakhaven. For 3 days the sun shone with surprising warmth, melting the snow off the pine needles and turning the dirt road leading up to Arthur S. cabin into a muddy rush. The air smelled of wet earth and impending spring, tricking the forest into a premature awakening. Scout seemed energized by the change. She spent more time away from the porch, disappearing into the woods shortly after sunrise, and not returning until the last light had faded from the sky. Arthur noticed a new leanness to her frame, the winter fat burning off as she actively hunted. Her limp was still there, a permanent hitch in her gait, but it didn't seem to slow her down. She moved with a fluid, predatory grace that commanded respect. Arthur spent those warm days on the porch, organizing his carving tools and sanding down the rough edges of the wooden bobcat figure. He felt a sense of deep, quiet contentment. The winter was breaking, and they had both survived it. He began to think about the coming spring, about clearing the garden bed Martha used to tend, perhaps planting a few rows of tomatoes. But the thaw was a liar. On the 4th morning, Arthur woke to a sky the colour of bruised iron. The temperature had plummeted overnight, a vicious, biting cold that felt sharper than anything January had offered. The mud on the road was frozen solid, jagged peaks of dirt waiting to twist an ankle. The wind wasn't howling, it was a low, constant moan that stripped the heat from everything it touched. When Arthur went to the front window, Scout was not on the swing. A spike of anxiety drove through his chest. He quickly pulled on his boots and coat and opened the door. The porch was empty. He checked under the swing, behind the firewood, even looking out toward the woodshed. Nothing. "Scout," he called out, his voice sharp against the freezing air. Silence answered him. He told himself not to worry. She was a wild animal. She knew how to survive. Perhaps she had found a better shelter in the woods, a hollow log or a shallow cave that offered more protection from this specific type of bitter cold. He went inside, made his coffee, and tried to settle into his routine, but his eyes kept drifting to the window, his ears straining for the familiar creak of the swing. By mid-afternoon, the worry had curdled into a cold, heavy dread. The temperature continued to drop, the mercury in the thermometer outside the kitchen window hovering dangerously close to zero. The wind picked up, carrying tiny, sharp ice crystals that scoured the siding of the cabin. Arthur paced the living room. He knew the signs. This wasn't just a cold snap, it was a killing freeze. Any animal caught exposed in this weather, especially one with a compromised limb, was in serious danger. He went to the hall closet and pulled out his heavy winter gear, the insulated coveralls, the thickest wool hat, the double-layered gloves. He wasn't going to sit inside while she was out there. He stepped off the porch and began to walk the perimeter of the cabin, searching for tracks. The ground was frozen too hard to hold clear prints, but he found a faint scuff mark near the edge of the woods, leading toward Pine Ridge. He followed it, his eyes scanning the underbrush, the shadows between the trees. "Scout!" he yelled, the wind snatching the sound from his mouth almost instantly. He walked for an hour, pushing deeper into the woods, the cold seeping through his layers. He checked the areas he knew she frequented, the rocky outcropping near Whispering Creek, the old, lightning-struck oak tree, the dense thicket of blackberry bushes. He saw nothing. No sign of movement, no flash of tawny fur. As the light began to fail, the reality of the situation settled over him like a suffocating blanket. If she was out here, injured or trapped, she wouldn't survive the night, and if he stayed out here much longer, he wouldn't either. The cold was beginning to affect his thinking, his fingers numb inside his thick gloves, his breath coming in shallow, painful gasps. He had to turn back. The walk back to the cabin was the longest Arthur had ever taken. The silence of the forest, usually a source of comfort, now felt hostile and mocking. He reached the porch as the last sliver of grey light disappeared from the sky. The swing hung empty and still. He went inside, locking the door behind him. He didn't take off his coat immediately. He stood in the middle of the living room, surrounded by the silence, and felt the familiar, crushing weight of loss press down on him. It was a different kind of loss than losing Martha, but the ache was terrifyingly similar. It was the pain of knowing that something you cared about was gone, and you were powerless to stop it. He built the fire up until the iron stove glowed dull red, the heat pushing back against the freezing walls. He sat in his armchair, staring at the empty braided rug. He didn't read, he didn't carve. He just sat there, listening to the wind scream around the eaves, hoping against all reason to hear the soft, rhythmic thumping of a tail against the door. But the only sound was the crackle of the dry oak, burning to ash in the dark. The storm raged for 3 agonizing days. It was a whiteout blizzard, the kind that buried Oakhaven under feet of snow and severed the town from the rest of the world. The power lines went down on the first night, plunging the cabin into darkness. Arthur relied on the wood stove for heat and kerosene lanterns for light, the yellow glow flickering against the frost-covered windows. He didn't sleep. He spent the night sitting in his armchair, wrapped in blankets, his eyes fixed on the front door. Every rattle of the wind, every groan of the settling house, sent a jolt of desperate hope through him. He would rush to the window, cupping his hands around his face to peer into the swirling white chaos, only to see the empty frozen porch. By the 3rd day, the hope had burned out, leaving behind a cold, hollow certainty. No animal, not even one as tough as a wild bobcat, could survive 3 days of this exposure, especially not with an old injury that hindered hunting. She was gone. Arthur moved through his chores with mechanical precision. He carried wood, melted snow for water, and ate canned soup cold directly from the tin. He felt a profound, heavy exhaustion that went deeper than lack of sleep. It was the exhaustion of a man who had dared to open his heart again, only to have the world slam it shut. He stopped looking at the braided rug near the stove. He stopped looking at the empty porch swing. He tried to lock those spaces away in his mind, just as he had done with Martha S. sewing room. It was the only way he knew how to survive the silence. On the morning of the 4th day, the wind finally broke. The storm passed, leaving behind a sky of blinding, impossible blue. The sun reflected off the pristine, untouched snow, hurting Arthur's eyes as he looked out the window. The world was beautiful, deadly, and completely silent. He needed to dig out. He needed the physical labour to push the grief down. He dressed in his heavy gear, pulled his snowshoes from the closet, and forced the front door open against a 3-foot drift. He spent the morning shoveling the porch and clearing a path to the woodshed. The physical exertion felt good. The burning in his lungs and the ache in his shoulders a welcome distraction. He worked relentlessly, not pausing to rest, driving himself until his breath came in ragged gasps. Around noon, he stopped to lean on his shovel, wiping the sweat from his forehead with the back of his glove. He looked out toward Pine Ridge. The trees were heavy with snow, their branches bending under the weight. And then he saw it. It was just a tiny disturbance in the perfect white canvas, about 50 yards away near the edge of the tree line. It looked like a small, dark trench cutting through the deep snow. Arthur's heart stopped. He dropped the shovel. He didn't bother taking off his snowshoes. He scrambled down the cleared path and waded into the deep drift, his movements clumsy in his haste. He pushed toward the tree line, his eyes locked on the dark line. As he got closer, the details resolved. It wasn't a natural formation. It was a trail. Something had dragged itself through the deep snow, struggling against the paralyzing cold. The trench was erratic, weaving side to side, indicating profound weakness. And then Arthur saw the blood. Small, dark crimson drops dotted the edge of the trench, stark and terrifying against the white snow. They weren't tea from a fresh kill. They were spaced evenly, matching the laboured progress of the animal that made the trail. Arthur began to run, the snowshoes kicking up clouds of white powder. He followed the trench into the shadows of the pines. The silence of the forest was absolute, amplifying the sound of his own ragged breathing. The trail led toward the rocky outcropping near Whispering Creek. Arthur scrambled up the incline, his gloves slipping on the ice-covered rocks. He reached the top and looked around frantically. "Scout!" he yelled, the desperation cracking his voice. Nothing. He followed the bloody trench as it wound through the rocks, leading toward a small, shallow overhang formed by 2 massive boulders. The space beneath it was dark, sheltered from the wind but offering little warmth. Arthur dropped to his knees, ignoring the sharp rocks digging through his coveralls. He peered into the darkness. At first, he saw nothing. Then, a shadow shifted. She was pressed against the furthest wall of the overhang, curled so tightly she looked half her normal size. Her tawny coat was matted, veille-capitée, hat ice and dark dried blood. Her left shoulder was swollen to twice its normal size, the old scar torn open and weeping sluggishly. Her eyes were closed, her breathing so shallow it was barely perceptible. She didn't react to Arthur's presence. She didn't twitch an ear or open an eye. She was completely, utterly spent. She had dragged herself as far as she could, seeking the only shelter she could find, and had simply stopped. "Oh, God," Arthur whispered, the sound torn from his throat. He didn't hesitate. He pulled off his heavy outer gloves, the freezing air biting his skin instantly. He reached into the darkness, his hands shaking, and gently gathered the icy broken body into his arms. She felt horrifyingly light, her bones fragile beneath the matted fur. She offered no resistance. She was limp, a terrifying dead weight in his. Arthur pulled her close to his chest, wrapping his heavy canvas coat around her as best he could to block the wind. He stood up, his knees trembling under the sudden burden. He didn't look back at the trail. He fixed his eyes on the roof of his cabin, visible through the trees, and began the agonizing trek back. He moved as fast as he dared, the snowshoes catching on hidden roots, his breath burning in his throat. He held her tight against his heart, praying with every step that he was too late. The cabin door slammed shut against the wind, rattling the framed picture of Martha that hung in the hallway. Arthur didn't pause to take off his boots. He carried Scout straight to the braided rug in front of the wood stove, laying her down with excruciating care. In the stark yellow light of the kerosene lantern, she looked even worse than she had in the cave. Her fur was clumped with frozen mud and dark, coagulated blood. The wound on her left shoulder, the old scar that had seemed to be healing so well, was split wide open. It wasn't a clean cut. It looked as if she had caught her leg in a snare or a jagged root, and in her panicked struggle to free herself, she had torn the muscle back to the bone. She was shivering. That was what terrified Arthur the most. The shivering was the body's last desperate attempt to generate heat. When the shivering stopped, the end was very close. He moved with frantic purpose. He threw 3 more heavy oak logs into the stove, opening the draught wide until the fire roared, turning the iron casing a dangerous cherry red. He ran to the hall closet and pulled out every blanket he owned, the old wool army surplus blankets, the thick down comforter from the guest bed, even the quilts Martha had made. He knelt beside the Bobcat and began to layer the blankets over her, careful not to put too Mosehat pressure on the mangled shoulder. He left only her face exposed. Her eyes were closed tight, her breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps that barely lifted her rib. He needed to get her core temperature up. He went to the kitchen, filled a rubber hot water bottle with water from the kettle simmering on the stove, wrapped it in a thick towel so it wouldn't burn her, and slid it under the blankets against her spine. Then he went to the phone. The line was dead. The storm had taken down the cables somewhere between Oakhaven and the main highway. He slammed the receiver down, a curse escaping his lips. He was completely alone. He had to be the one to save her, and he had no idea what he was doing. He went back to the rug and sat cross-legged beside her. He took off his thick gloves, his hands still numb from the cold, and gently touched the exposed fur on her neck. It was icy, the skin underneath feeling like marble. "Don't you quit," he whispered, his voice cracking in the silent room. "You hear me? You don't quit now." For the next 4 hours, Arthur didn't move from the rug. He watched her chest, counting the seconds between each shallow breath. He changed the hot water bottle twice, ensuring a steady, gentle heat radiated into her frozen body. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the deep chill began to break. The ice in her fur melted, soaking the bottom blanket. Around 8 o'clock that evening, her body gave a sudden, violent twitch. Then the shivering started. It was a terrifying, full-body tremor that rattled her teeth and shook the blankets covering her. But to Arthur, it was the most beautiful sound in the world. It meant her body was fighting back. He stayed beside her, his hand resting lightly on her good shoulder, offering whatever comfort a human hand could give a wild thing. He didn't sleep. He listened to the wind howl outside, a distant, muffled roar against the steady crackle of the fire. Sometime around 3 a.m, the shivering finally subsided. Her breathing deepened, the shallow gasps replaced by a rhythmic pull of air. Arthur leaned forward, his face close to hers. "Scout," he murmured softly. Her eyelids fluttered. They didn't open fully, just a narrow slit, revealing a sliver of dull gold. She could lift her head, but she let out a low, rough sound, not a hiss, not a growl, but a long, exhausted exhalation. Arthur let out a breath he felt like he had been holding for 3 days. She was alive. She had survived the freezing cold. But as he looked at the dark, wet stain spreading across the wool blanket where her left shoulder rested, he knew the battle was only half. The infection and the structural damage were the real threats now. He had to get her to a doctor or get a doctor to her, and for that he had to wait for the road to clear. It took 2 days for the county ploughs to reach the dirt road leading to Arthur S. cabin. For those 48 hours, cabin became a makeshift intensive care unit. Scout remained on the braided rug, too weak to move, her world reduced to the warmth of the stove and the heavy wool blankets. Arthur barely slept. He carefully cleaned the terrible wound on her shoulder. They kept hot boiled water and clean rags, his stomach twisting at the sight of the torn muscle. The bobcat didn't fight him. She seemed to understand with the deep, pragmatic intelligence of wild things that she needed. She would lie perfectly still, her eyes squeezed shut, bearing the pain of the cleaning with silent stoicism. He fed her rich broth from a dropper, coaxing her to swallow, celebrating every ounce of liquid that stayed down. She was a shadow of the animal that had sunned herself on the porch swing just days ago, a tawny coat dull and her spirit seemingly broken. When Arthur finally heard the deep, grinding rumble of the snowplow pushing past the end of his driveway, he threw on his coat and ran out to flag the driver down. He needed to get to town. The drive into Oakhaven was slow and treacherous, the truck slipping on the packed ice. Arthur didn't go to Miller's Hardware for supplies. He drove straight to the small, single-story brick building that housed the veterinary clinic. Doctor. Sarah Jenkins looked up from her charts as Arthur burst through the front door. She took one look at his pale, exhausted face and set her pen down. "It's the Bobcat," Arthur said, his chest heaving. "She bad. Doc. Really bad. She got caught in something out there in the storm. Ripped her shoulder wide open." Sarah did ask questions. She grabbed her heavy black medical bag, a box of trauma supplies, and her coat. "Let's go," she said simply. They drove back to the cabin in silence. When they arrived, Sarah walked straight to the living room, stripping off her coat as she knelt beside the rug. She gently pulled back the blanket. Scout opened her eyes, the golden irises contracting at the sight of a stranger. She let out a weak, breathy hiss, her instinct trying to marshal a defense she didn't possess. "Easy now." "Beautiful," Sarah murmured, her voice calm and professional. She didn't reach out to pet the animal. She respected the boundary. She opened her bag and pulled out a small, preloaded syringe. "Mort met going to give her a heavy sedative, Arthur," Sarah explained quietly. "Mort need to clean this out properly and see what we're re-dealing with, and Mort can do that while she is conscious. She's too stressed." Arthur nodded, stepping back to give her room. He watched as Sarah expertly found a vein in the bobcat's good hind leg. Within minutes, Scout's head lowered to the rug, her eyes closing, the tension draining from her body. Sarah went to work. She cleaned the wound thoroughly, her face grim. Arthur brought her hot water and fresh towels, functioning as her silent assistant. "It's a mess," Sarah said finally, sitting back on her heels and wiping her forehead with the back of her wrist. The original injury was a distal fracture, a break near the joint. It had healed, but poorly. Whatever she caught herself on out there during the storm tore the scar tissue and strained the weakened joint completely. "The muscle damage is extensive. Can you fix it?" Arthur asked, his voice rough. Sarah looked at him, her expression serious. "Mort can stitch the muscle, clean the infection, and give her strong antibiotics. But Arthur, this leg will never be the same. The joint is compromised. In the wild, a predator that can T-run can T-hunt efficiently. She's going to be severely disadvantaged. She survived this long," Arthur pointed out stubbornly. "She survived because you've been feeding her," Sarah corrected gently. "She's smart. She adapted. But this is a permanent disability." She spent the next hour carefully suturing the torn muscle and skin, her hands moving vacapite hat practiced efficiency. She administered a long-lasting antibiotic shot and wrapped the shoulder in a thick, supportive bandage. "She's going to be out for a few more hours," Sarah said as she packed her bag. "When she wakes up, she's going to be confused and in pain. Keep her confined. Don't let her try to walk on it. Mortlugglunk leave you some pain medication you can mix into her food." Arthur walked her to the door. "Thank you." "Doc, what do Mott owe you?" Sarah shook her head. "Just keep her alive." "Arthur, that S payment enough for today? Call me in 3 days with an update." Arthur closed the door and walked back to the living room. The cabin smelled of antiseptic and blood. He sat in his armchair and looked at the sleeping wildcat, the white bandage stark against her dark coat. He didn't know what the future held for her, whether she could ever return to the wild, but he knew one thing ver capiteha absolute certainty. As long as she needed a safe place to heal, the porch swing was hers. The healing process was not a straight line, it was a grueling, jagged climb. For the first 2 weeks after the surgery, Scout barely moved from the braided rug. The pain medication Sarah had left kept her sedated, a necessary haze that prevented her from tearing at her stitches or trying to put weight on the shattered joint. Arthur's life shrank entirely to the dimensions of the living room. He moved his mattress from the bedroom to the floor near the stove, refusing to let her wake up alone in the dark. He fed her rich, warm broths mixed with the crushed pills, using a plastic syringe when she was too weak to lap from the bowl. He changed the dressings on her shoulder with agonizing slowness, enduring her low, warning growls with quiet patience. He talked to her constantly. It wasn't conversation, it was a steady stream of low, reassuring sound intended to anchor her in the unfamiliar environment. He read aloud from his old paperbacks, his gravelly voice filling the cabin with stories of distant places and old wars. Sometimes he just told her about his day, detailing the simple acts of making coffee or bringing in firewood as if they were significant events. "You redoing good?" "Scout," he would murmur, carefully replacing the white bandage over the angry red line of stitches. "Just a little longer. You re the toughest thing on Pine Ridge." "You know that." She would watch him with drug-dulled amber eyes, her black-tipped tail giving a weak twitch in response to his voice. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the intent. The hands that touched her, that cleaned her wound and brought her food, were hands that offered only safety. By the 3rd week, the worst of the infection had passed, and the heavy sedation was no longer necessary. As her mind cleared, the wild instinct to move, to patrol her territory, returned with a vengeance. It started with small, frustrating attempts to stand. She would push herself up on her 3 good legs, the bandaged left shoulder hovering above the floor, and immediately lose her balance, collapsing back onto the rug with a frustrated hiss. Arthur watched these struggles with an aching heart, knowing he couldn't help her learn to walk again. She had to find her own center of gravity. He modified the cabin for her. He placed non-slip mats around the wood stove to give her better traction. He moved her food and water bowls closer to the rug so she didn't have to navigate the slippery linoleum of the kitchen. Her breakthrough came on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. Arthur was sitting in his armchair, carving a piece of soft pine. He heard the familiar scuff of claws on the rug and looked down. Scout was standing. She was trembling slightly from the effort. Her weight shifted entirely to her right side. Her left leg held awkwardly against her chest. She stood there for a long minute, swaying slightly as she recalibrated her balance. Then, she took a step. It was a jerky, uncoordinated hop, landing heavily on her right front paw. She paused, assessing the movement. She took another hop. Arthur held his breath, his carving knife motionless. He watched as she slowly, painstakingly navigated the 4 feet from the rug to the edge of the armchair. She stopped near his boots, her sides heaving slightly from the exertion. She looked up at him, her pale, notched ear swiveling forward. Arthur didn't move. He didn't want to startle her and cause a fall. Scout stretched her neck forward and sniffed the toe of his leather boot. Then, with deliberate slowness. She lowered her head and rubbed the side of her face against his denim-clad calf. It was a brief, almost accidental contact, a marking of territory, a claim of ownership. She turned and began the difficult journey back to the rug, her hops slightly more confident now. Arthur exhaled slowly, a profound sense of relief washing over him. She was going to make it. The wildness in her was bruised, but it wasn't broken. From that day on, her mobility improved rapidly. The hops became a strange, loping gait that compensated for the ruined shoulder. She learned to navigate the cabin, exploring the corners she had never seen, though she always returned to the braided rug by the stove to sleep. The stitches were removed, leaving behind a thick, hairless scar that tracked across her shoulder like a map of her survival. As the winter slowly began to loosen its grip on Oakhaven, the snow outside melting into slush and mud, Arthur knew a new challenge was approaching. The cabin had been a sanctuary, a hospital, a place of healing, but Scout was a creature of the forest, and the forest was calling her home. The thaw arrived in late March, Verkepti Heart, a sudden violent intensity. The snow melt turned Whispering Creek into a roaring torrent of muddy water, and the frozen earth around the cabin gave way to a soft, fragrant dampness. The air no longer carried the sharp bite of winter. It smelled of wet pine needles and the faint, sweet promise of new growth. For Scout, the change in the weather triggered an undeniable restlessness. The cabin, which had been her sanctuary for over a month, suddenly seemed too small, too close. She spent her days pacing between the front door and the window, her loping, three-legged gait a constant rhythmic sound against the floorboards. She would sit by the glass for hours, her amber eyes tracking the movement of the squirrels in the oak trees, her tufted ears swiveling to catch the sounds of the waking forest. Arthur watched her with a mixture of pride and quiet dread. He knew the time had come. He had kept his promise to Dr. Jenkins. He had kept her alive. Her shoulder had healed completely, the thick hairless scar standing out starkly against her tawny coat. But she was a wild thing, and the wild was calling her back. He worried about her ability to survive. Her limp was severe. When she moved quickly, it was an awkward, almost painful-looking hobble. She couldn't climb trees with the speed necessary to escape larger predators, and her hunting technique would have to be entirely reinvented. He feared the forest would show her no mercy. On a warm Tuesday morning, Arthur decided it was time. He opened the front door, propping it wide with a heavy cast-iron doorstop. He didn't say anything. He simply walked back to his armchair and sat down, picking up a piece of cedar and his carving knife. Scout stopped her pacing. She stood in the center of the living room, staring at the open door. The smells of the forest rushed in, the rich earth, the damp bark, the sharp scent of pine sap. She took a tentative step toward the threshold, her nose twitching rapidly. She paused at the doorframe, looking out at the porch and the woods beyond. She didn't bolt immediately. She stood there for a long time, assessing the world she had been separated from for so long. Then, she turned her head and looked back at Arthur. He didn't stop carving. He didn't meet her eyes. He wanted to make it easy for her, to remove any pressure his gaze might exert. He let the rhythmic sound of the knife against the wood fill the silence. With a soft, almost imperceptible huff of breath, Scout turned back to the door and stepped out onto the porch. Her claws clicked on the wooden planks. She walked to the edge of the steps, paused to sniff the air one last time, and then descended into the yard. Arthur finally looked up, watching her through the window. She moved slowly toward the tree line, her loping gait highlighting the permanent damage to her shoulder. She didn't look back. Within moments, the shadows of the pines swallowed her, leaving the yard empty. The silence in the cabin was profound, a sudden vacuum that pulled at the air in Arthur's lungs. He set his carving knife down on the small table beside his chair. The house felt huge again, the walls too far apart. He realized he had been holding his breath, waiting for a miraculous turn that didn't happen. He walked to the door and removed the cast-iron stop, letting the heavy wood swing shut with a final, decisive click. He told himself it was for the best. She was where she belonged. He had done his part. He spent the rest of the day cleaning the cabin, meticulously scrubbing the linoleum around the stove, putting away the extra blankets, trying to erase the physical evidence of her presence. It was an exercise in futility. Every corner of the room held a memory of her, the way she slept by the fire, the sound of her claws on the floor, the intense golden stare that had watched him for weeks. That evening, Arthur didn't prepare the small bowl of venison. He made his own dinner, ate it in silence, and sat by the stove. The fire crackled, but it didn't provide the same comfort it had during the deep winter. The house was just a house again. As dusk settled over Pine Ridge, painting the sky in shades of violet and deep blue, Arthur found himself listening. He told himself he was just listening to the wind, to the creek, to the normal sounds of the mountain. But his ears strained for something specific. The silence stretched on, heavy and unbroken. Arthur let out a long, slow sigh. He stood up to add another log to the fire, ready to accept the quiet reality of his life. And then he heard it. It was faint at first, almost lost in the rustle of the oak leaves. A soft, familiar sound. Creak. Arthur froze, the log suspended in his hand. He waited, his heart hammering against his ribs. Creak. Groan. It was the cedar porch swing. Arthur placed the log carefully on the fire, the wood catching instantly with a sharp crackle. He wiped his hands on his denim overalls, his palms suddenly slick with sweat. He walked to the front window, moving with deliberate slowness, afraid that any sudden motion would shatter the fragile possibility waiting on the other side of the glass. The porch was bathed in the pale light of a rising half-moon. The old cedar swing, the one Martha had loved so much, was swaying gently back and forth. Sitting squarely in the centre of the wooden slats, illuminated by a shaft of moonlight that cut through the pines, was Scout. She looked exactly as she had when she left that morning, her tawny coat a shade darker in the night, the stark white scar on her shoulder clearly visible. She wasn't huddled or shivering. She was sitting tall, her amber eyes calm and watchful as she surveyed the quiet yard. Arthur let out a breath that sounded suspiciously like a dry sob. He leaned his forehead against the cold glass, closing his eyes for a brief moment. She had come back, against all the instincts of her wild nature, against the logic of survival. She had returned to the porch. He didn't open the door. He didn't want to bring her inside, to force her back into the enclosed space she had clearly needed to escape. He understood now. She wasn't he a pet, and she wasn't he entirely wild anymore. She had carved out a unique space between the two worlds, a compromise forged in the fires of a brutal winter. This became their permanent routine, a quiet devotion that dictated the rhythm of their lives. Every morning, just before the sun crested the ridge, Scout would rise from the swing, stretch her good legs, and disappear into the forest. Arthur never knew how she managed to hunt with her ruined shoulder. He assumed she had learned to rely on ambush rather than speed, using her incredible patience to wait for unwary prey. She spent her days as a creature of the woods, wild and independent. But as the shadows lengthened and the purple dusk began to fall over Oakhaven, the familiar creak of the cedar swing would echo across the porch. Arthur always made sure the green wool blanket was folded neatly on the slats. He never left food out for her again. Dr. Jenkins had warned him that feeding a wild predator long-term would only dull her instincts further and attract unwanted scavengers. Scout didn't seem to mind. She wasn't returning for a handout. She was returning for the safety of the swing, for the familiar smells of wood smoke and cedar, for the quiet presence of the man inside the cabin. Sometimes, on warm summer evenings, Arthur would sit on the porch steps, leaning against the railing with a cup of decaf coffee. Scout would lie on the swing behind him, the chains groaning softly as she shifted her weight. They did interact. Arthur didn't reach back to touch her, and she didn't approach him. They simply shared the space, two solitary figures finding comfort in the proximity of another quiet soul. He often talked to her on those evenings, his voice a low rumble that blended with the sound of Whispering Creek. He told her about the pieces he was carving, about the changing weather, about the memories of Martha that felt less painful now, softened by time and the steady rhythm of his new life. Scout would listen, her notched ear swiveling toward the sound of his voice, her golden eyes half closed in contentment. She was a silent confidante, a wild spirit tethered to the porch not by necessity, but by a choice he would never fully understand. The townspeople of Oakhaven rarely saw her. Occasionally, a delivery driver or a neighbour stopping by for a custom piece of woodwork would catch a glimpse of a tawny shape vanishing into the trees, and they would ask Arthur if he had seen a bobcat hanging around. Arthur would always smile, a small, knowing expression that crinkled the corners of his eyes. Just a neighbour passing through, he would say, turning back to his work. She keeps to herself. He never told them about the long winter nights, the terrifying fever, the slow agonizing recovery. He never explained the intricate language of silence and space they had developed. It was a secret he kept fiercely, protecting the dignity of the wild thing that had trusted him when she had nowhere else to go. As the years passed, Arthur's hair turned completely white, and his stoop became a little more pronounced. The carving knife grew heavier in his hand, but he never stopped working the cedar, and Scout never stopped returning. Her coat grew duller vers capite hat age, and her limp became more pronounced, a stiff, laboured gait that spoke of old bones and old injuries, but the fierce, intelligent light in her golden eyes never faded. They grew old together, the retired carpenter and the scarred bobcat, bound by quiet devotion that needed no words. The cabin on Pine Ridge remained a sanctuary, a testament to the fact that sometimes the things we cannot fix are the very things that save us. The transition from late autumn to winter always brought a specific kind of silence to Pine Ridge. It wasn't an empty silence, but a waiting one, the forest holding its breath before the first snow. Arthur Pendleton felt it in his bones, the familiar ache in his joints, a more reliable forecast than the radio in the kitchen. He was 73 now, his movements slower, more deliberate. The stack of firewood beside the porch seemed a little taller that year, the effort required to split it a little more demanding. But he maintained his routine with the stubborn resilience of a man who knew the value of a quiet life. It had been 5 years since the terrible storm that brought Scout to his door. 5 years of shared evenings, of the rhythmic creak of the cedar swing, of a bond built entirely on unspoken trust. She was an old cat now. The wild had been surprisingly kind to her, perhaps respecting the fierce will that had carried her through that first brutal winter. But time was an undeniable force. Her tawny coat was heavily peppered with grey, especially around her muzzle and the tufts of her ears. The pale notch on her left ear was almost indistinguishable from the silver fur surrounding it. Her limp, the permanent legacy of her shattered shoulder, had slowed her down considerably. She spent more time on the porch swing now, often returning from the woods by mid-afternoon rather than dusk, seeking the sun-warmed blankets before the chill set in. Arthur understood. He was slowing down too. They were two old souls, weathering the turning of the seasons side by side. On a crisp November afternoon, the sky a pale hard blue, Arthur sat on the top step of the porch. He was wearing his heavy canvas coat and a thick wool hat, a steaming mug of decaf resting beside his worn leather boots. He was tea carving. He was just watching the wind move through the pines, listening to the dry rustle of the oak leaves. Behind him, the cedar swing swayed gently. Scout was awake, lying on the folded green blanket. She was watching him, her golden eyes, though slightly clouded with age, still sharp and intelligent. Arthur reached down and picked up his mug, the ceramic warm against his calloused palms. He didn't turn around, but he spoke, his gravelly voice carrying easily in the still air. Going to be a hard winter. Not think, he said softly. The squirrels are hoarding deep this year. You feel it too, don't you, old girl? Scout let out a low, breathy huff, a sound that Arthur had come to interpret as agreement. She shifted her weight on the blanket, her chin resting on her paws, her gaze fixed on the back of his canvas coat. Arthur took a slow sip of his coffee. The air smelled of wood smoke and pine, the scent of his life on the ridge. He thought about the years he had spent in this cabin, the loud, joyful years with Martha, and the quiet, echoing years after she was gone. He realized with a profound sense of peace that the echoes had stopped. The house was no longer defined by what was missing, but by what was present. He hadn't saved the wildcat, not really. He had provided a warm room and a doctor, but she had saved herself. She had chosen to fight, and she had chosen to stay. In return, without ever intending to, she had saved him. She had given him a reason to keep the fire burning, a reason to watch the window, a reason to care about the cold. She had taught him that the world, even in its most brutal, unforgiving moments, still held the capacity for grace. The sun dipped below the tree line, casting long, purple shadows across the yard. The temperature dropped sharply, the first real bite of the coming winter. Arthur finished his coffee and slowly stood up, his knees popping in the cold. He turned and looked at the swing. Scout was still watching him. She didn't move as he approached, her trust absolute. He didn't reach out to touch her. He didn't need to. He simply offered her a slow, respectful nod, a silent acknowledgement of the years they had shared. "Sleep warm tonight," Arthur murmured. He turned and walked inside, the screen door closing softly behind him with a familiar click. He didn't lock the heavy inner door. He left it slightly ajar, just in case the wind howled too loud and the wild thing needed the rug by the stove. He walked into the living room, the wood stove radiating a comforting heat. The cabin was quiet, but it was a warm, full quiet. It was the silence of a home that was exactly as it should be. Outside, the wind began to whisper through the pines, a low, constant sound that promised snow. On the porch, the old cedar swing swayed gently in the cold air, carrying the weight of a scarred bobcat who had refused to leave the wild, but had found a way to share her solitude. The night settled over Oak Haven, deep and peaceful, wrapping the cabin and its inhabitants in a quiet, enduring devotion. Thank you for spending this time with us. If this story brought a moment of peace to your day, consider leaving a gentle like or subscribing to the channel. We would love to read your comments below, telling us where you are watching from and about the animals that have touched your own life.
The Heroic Veteran Dogs is a fictional channel created to entertain, educate, and inspire the audience by exploring the deep, loyal bond between veterans and their dogs. All channel content does not represent real individuals, actual events, or documented cases. Any resemblance to real people, animals, or events is entirely coincidental.